Just north of the town of Obunsi stands a marker in honor of the diverse, brave men and women who traveled to that area. The sign reads, Ad Astra per Aspera, which means, a rough road leads to the stars. That monument has more meaning than most people know.
The journey to freedom was unlike the highway tolls that you and I pay today. Braving the Underground Railroad guaranteed exhaustion, mental, physical, and psychological. Thousands tried to pay the toll for freedom. Only a few made it, and the ones that didn't were sent back to the farms they tried to escape from.
It is estimated that between 20,000 and 30,000 slaves were held along the western border of Missouri, but over 115,000 statewide. Although most slaveholders had fewer than 10 slaves, the work that was required of them was every bit as grueling as those on larger plantations in the South. Still, due to their smaller size, it gave the opportunity for slaves to look beyond their masters' farms and to establish connections on other farms that would enable some of them to escape.
It's a story that can't be forgotten because there's so much injustice. There's so much hatred. And it's something that we can't ever allow to happen again in our country and in the greater sense in the whole world. The best way that we can fight ignorance is to educate. And so kids need to know this story about human injustice, about doing what is right, about going and believing in something to the point where you take action on it.
Every day across the United States, school children recite the Pledge of Allegiance. The last sentence states, with liberty and justice for all. That liberty and justice came at a price. In America, between 1607 and 1865, African Americans didn't have their freedom. During this time period, they fought to be free. However, their story has often been excluded from the American experience. Why? Because most of their stories come from the oral tradition. And until the Civil Rights era, their story wasn't considered important. African Americans, Native Americans, and Euro Americans worked together here in Kansas between 1854 and 1861 to make Kansas a free state. They established the western edge of the Underground Railroad in this country, which started the long journey to liberty and justice.
Imagine a world where the lines between liberty and bondage blur, where the quest for liberation did lead individuals back into the depths of servitude, a world where the promise of freedom is a mere illusion, leading to more unimaginable bondage, where the air is riddled with the tension of uncertainty and safety is nowhere near assurance. It was from slavery to slavery. That's the very essence of the counterfeit Underground Railroad called the Reverse Underground Railroad. In the annals of American history, there was this place once called the Underground Railroad, which served as a beacon of hope and resilience, a clandestine network that guided countless enslaved individuals to freedom. Yet, lurking in the shadows of this celebrated narrative is a lesser known, yet equally compelling story, the Reverse Underground Railroad, revealing a chilling reality of where the very same routes that once led to liberation were repurposed to ensnare free black people and enslaved individuals alike, dragging them back into the depths of bondage and slavery. Join us on this journey as we peel back the layers of history to reveal the untold story of the Reverse Underground Railroad, with us examining first a narrative that vividly reflects the real experiences of countless enslaved individuals who endured unimaginable suffering and yet held onto hope for a better future, leading them to embrace the freedom the Underground Railroad offered. But before we proceed, do not forget to support our efforts by hitting that like button before you. Share with your family and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and kindly subscribe to stay tuned in for more informative stories ahead. Now to the crux of the matter. The history of slavery is marked by profound suffering and inhumanity, and the experiences of enslaved individuals varied widely, depending on the time, period, location, and specific circumstances. Here is a narrative that reflects the harsh realities faced by many enslaved people, drawing on historical accounts and testimonies. In the early 19th century, in the American South, a young woman named Eliza was born into slavery on a cotton plantation. From a young age, she was aware of her status as property, not a person. The plantation owner, Mr. Thompson, was known for his brutal methods of maintaining control over his slaves. The air was thick with the scent of cotton and the sounds of whips cracking, a constant reminder of the harsh reality of their existence. As Eliza grew older, she would be assigned to the fields, where she would work from dawn till dusk, picking cotton under the scorching sun. The overseer, Mr. Jenkins, a cruel individual, would patrol the rows with a whip in hand, ready to punish anyone who dared to slow down or falter. Eliza witnessed her fellow slaves endure horrific beatings for minor infractions. One day, she saw a man, Samuel by name, who had been unable to keep up due to exhaustion, receiving a brutal lashing that left his back raw and bleeding. This sad sight would haunt her unendingly, a grim reminder of the price of disobedience. The physical toll of the work was immense. Eliza's hands were calloused and sore from the constant plucking of cotton bolls, and her back would ache from bending over for hours on end. The psychological torment was equally devastating. Families were often torn apart, sold to different plantations without warning. Eliza's mother had been sold when she was just a child, and the pain of that loss lingered in her heart. At night, after a long day in the fields, Eliza and the other slaves would gather in the small quarters they shared. The air was thick with despair, but they found solace in each other's company. They would share stories, sing songs of hope, and dream of freedom. Yet, the fear of the overseer loomed large. If caught, they could face severe punishment. On a particular night, a group of slaves were discovered trying to escape. The next morning, the plantation was eerily quiet, and Eliza learned that the escapees had been captured and publicly whipped as a warning to others. The psychological manipulation was relentless. Mr. Thompson would often remind them that they were nothing without him, that they were lucky to have a roof over their heads and food to eat. He would parade his wealth and power, reminding them of their place in the world. Eliza felt the weight of his words, internalizing the belief that she was less than human. As the years passed, Eliza's spirit began to wane. The hope of freedom seemed distant, overshadowed by the daily brutality of her existence. She witnessed the horrors of the auction block, where families were separated and individuals were sold to the highest bidder. The cries of mothers and children echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the fragility of their lives. One fateful day, a new slave arrived at the plantation. His name was James, and he carried with him a spark of defiance. He spoke of the Underground Railroad, a network of individuals who helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Eliza felt a flicker of hope reignite within her. Together they began to dream of a life beyond the plantation, a life where they could be free. But the risks were immense. They knew that if caught, the consequences would be dire. The thought of being whipped, or worse, was a constant fear. Yet the desire for freedom was stronger than the fear of punishment. They would begin to plan their escape, gathering supplies and mapping out their route under the cover of darkness. And then on this particular moonless night, Eliza and James would make their move. They slipped away from the quarters, hearts pounding with fear and excitement. The journey was fraught with danger as they navigated through the woods, avoiding patrols and relying on the stars to guide them through. Each rustle in the bushes sent shivers down their spines, but they pressed on, driven by the hope of a new life. After days of dangerous travel, they finally reached a safe house, where they were welcomed by abolitionists who offered them food and shelter. Eliza felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she knew their journey was far from over. The scars of her past would remain, but she was determined to forge a new path, one where she could live as a free woman. Eliza's case gives a clear scenario of what enslaved Africans go through. And worse in this dark age, how many have risked their lives in a bid to opt out from the shackles and harsh conditions of slavery into an outside world that promises freedom. Their sure escape route was, of course, through the Underground Railroad operated by notable abolitionists like Harriet Tubman, who was one of the figures related to the Underground Railroad. Tubman had escaped from enslavement in 1849 and went to Philadelphia, where she vowed to return for other members of her family and to help others escape. And being true to her words, she made her first trip back to the South after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 and returned a total of 13 times to the South, where she would help more than 300 people escape slavery. Her life and character are an outstanding example of selfless dedication to freedom and the abolition of slavery. Now to the story of the Underground Railroad. For several decades up until the start of the Civil War, the network known as the Underground Railroad operated in the U.S. to help slaves escape into the northern states and sometimes to Canada. Despite the name, the network was not actually a railroad, but a series of safe houses and special routes slaves could use during their escape toward freedom. Also, the Underground Railroad did not actually run underground, but through homes, barns, churches, and businesses. And according to some estimates, between 1810 and 1850, the Underground Railroad had helped to guide 100,000 enslaved people to freedom. Impressive, isn't it? While patrols seeking to catch enslaved people were frequently hot on escapees' heels, lanterns in the windows of the Underground Railroad welcomed them and promised safety. Although enslaved Africans and African Americans escaped from slavery as early as the 16th century, with many of their escapes unaided, the network of safe houses operated by agents, generally known as the Underground Railroad, began to organize in the 1780s among abolitionist societies in the North. It ran north and grew steadily until the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln. The escapees sought primarily to escape into free states and from there to Canada. However, the network, which was primarily the work of free and enslaved African Americans, was assisted by abolitionists and others sympathetic to the cause of the escapees. The people who worked for the Underground Railroad had a passion for justice and would drive to end the practice of slavery, a drive so strong that they risked their lives and jeopardized their own freedom to help enslaved people escape from bondage and keep them safe along the route. Moreover, as the network grew, the railroad metaphor stuck. Conductors guided runaway enslaved people from place to place along the routes. The places that sheltered the runaways were referred to as stations, and the people who hid the enslaved people were called station masters. The fugitives traveling along the routes were called passengers, and those who had arrived at the safe houses were called cargo. Research has shown that most of those who participated in the Underground Railroad largely worked alone, rather than as part of an organized group. There were people from many occupations and income levels, including former enslaved persons. According to historical accounts of the railroad, conductors often posed as enslaved people and snuck the runaways out of plantations. Also, due to the dangers associated with capture, they conducted much of their activity at night. The conductors and passengers would travel from safe house to safe house, often with 16 to 19 kilometers, that is 10 to 20 miles, between each stop. Various other routes led to Mexico, where slavery had been abolished, and to islands in the Caribbean that were not part of the slave trade. During the American Civil War, freedom seekers escaped to Union lines in the South to obtain their freedom. One estimate suggests that by 1850, approximately 100,000 slaves had escaped to freedom via the network of the Underground Railroad. Also, according to former professor of Pan-African Studies, J. Blaine Hudson, by the end of the American Civil War, 500,000 or more African Americans self-emancipated themselves from slavery on the Underground Railroad. However, estimates of the number of black people who reached freedom varied greatly, from 40,000 to 100,000. Also, although only a small minority of Northerners participated in the Underground Railroad, its existence did much to arouse Northern sympathy for the lot of the slave in the antebellum period, at the same time convincing many Southerners that the North as a whole would never peaceably allow the institution of slavery to remain unchallenged. Nevertheless, while the Underground Railroad had many supporters in northern states, Not everybody was happy about the help escaped slaves were receiving. Hence, the reverse Underground Railroad, which kidnapped black people in northern states and forced them back into slavery in the South, was born out of this discontent and greed. However, as the name suggests, the reverse Underground Railroad played the exact opposite role of the Underground Railroad. It was a much more nefarious secret network that performed the reverse function of what the Underground Railroad was involved in. The pre-American Civil War practice of kidnapping into slavery in the United States occurred in both free and slave states, and both fugitive slaves and free Negroes were transported to slave markets and sold, often multiple times. There were also rewards for the return of fugitives. 3 types of kidnapping methods were employed. 1. Physical abduction. 2. Inveiglement, that is, kidnapping through trickery of free blacks. And 3. Apprehension of fugitives. The enslavement or re-enslavement of free blacks occurred for 85 years, from 1780 to 1865. Those who used the term reverse Underground Railroad were angered at an Underground Railroad helping slaves escape. Rescues of blacks who had been kidnapped were unusual. The name is a reference to the Underground Railroad, the informal network of abolitionists and sympathizers who helped smuggle escaped slaves to freedom, generally in Canada, but also in Mexico, where slavery had been abolished. Free African Americans were often kidnapped from the southernmost free states, along the borders of the slave states of Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. But kidnapping was also prevalent in states further north, such as New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, as well as in abolition-minded regions of some southern states, such as Tennessee. Free blacks in New York City and Philadelphia were particularly vulnerable to kidnapping. In New York, a gang known as the Blackbirders regularly waylaid men, women, and children, sometimes with the support and participation of policemen and city officials. In Philadelphia, black newspapers frequently ran missing children notices, including one for the 14-year-old daughter of the newspaper's editor. Children were particularly susceptible to kidnapping. In a 2-year period, at least 100 children were abducted in Philadelphia alone. From 1811 to 1829, Martha Patty Cannon, an illegal slave trader, serial killer, and the co-leader of the multiracial Cannon-Johnson gang of Maryland, Delaware, was the leader of a gang that kidnapped slaves and free blacks from the Delmarva Peninsula of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and Chesapeake Bay, and transported and sold them to plantation owners located further south. The group operated for about a decade in the early 19th century and abducted hundreds of free black people and fugitive slaves across multiple state lines to sell into slavery in southern states such as Alabama and Mississippi. She was indicted for 4 murders in 1829 and died in prison while awaiting trial, purportedly a suicide via arsenic poisoning. Historian Richard Bell, who teaches early American history at the University of Maryland, explained that the catalyst for the development of this network was a legislation in 1808 that outlawed the import of humans from Africa and the Caribbean for slave labor. This had a significant economic impact for Deep South states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, who faced a shortage of forced labor, mostly for cotton production. They were compelled to use American-born labor, but legitimately purchasing slaves from other slave owners was expensive, and supply did not meet the increased demand. Instead, they turned to illegal smuggling of free black people to the South from northern states. Thus, between 1808 and the Civil War, tens of thousands of free black individuals were snatched, most never to be heard from again by their loved ones. The slave market continued to grow in the country alongside the cotton market in the southwestern states. A slave that would sell for $300 in Virginia would get as much as $1,200 in states in the Southwest. As a result, a trade developed even among states in the South, where slaves born in a southern state would be sold to other states. It became such a profitable business as the price per slave continued to grow year after year, fueling the kidnapping surge. Like the better-known Underground Railroad, the reverse Underground Railroad was loosely organized and operated in secrecy. Traffic on both was roughly the same, moving hundreds of individuals annually. But while the Underground Railroad is seen as a good organization, helping black people escape the evils of enslavement, the reverse Underground Railroad was just the opposite, cruelly taking free individuals and enslaving them. Moreover, Bell stated that unlike the Underground Railroad, where there is considerable documented historical information, little documentation is found on the reverse Underground Railroad and those involved. Bribes, corruption, and apathy protected the operatives, with police turning a blind eye to their activities and white people showing indifference. Sadly, the kidnappers mostly targeted poor, often illiterate or homeless, young street kids, both boys and girls. Philadelphia was a popular target because it was the closest major free city to the slavery states in the South. The kidnapped individuals were forced to walk incredibly long distances, and many were sold off one by one along the route. Unlike slave auctions of the time, where records of sales were typically recorded, there are few records of what happened to many of these individuals. Also, during the pre-Civil War period, child snatching was prevalent and black freedom very fragile, as even free black people were not safe or protected. In addition to capturing free black people from the northern states, kidnappers and traffickers of the reverse Underground Railroad also worked to recapture slaves that had managed to escape. Many kidnappers, however, used trickery to lure black people into slavery. For example, in the book, A Portraiture of Domestic Slavery, author Jesse Torrey tells the story of a man from Philadelphia who forced mixed-race women into marrying him and then sold them as slaves. Also, kidnappers sometimes approached a free black person with a job offer or claimed a free black person was actually a runaway slave. And with no proof to the contrary, the law often sided with them. In a paper published in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, researcher Julie Winch gave another example of kidnappers tricking parents with a promise that their child could learn a trade, only to then disappear with that child on the way to the South and never be seen again. These and many other schemes were adopted to kidnap free black people and runaway slaves, throwing them back into another harrowing experience of slavery, and for the sole aim of making whooping sums out of them. The most famous story involving the reverse Underground Railroad is that of Solomon Northup, whose story was popularized in the 2013 Oscar-winning movie, 12 Years a Slave. Northup was born a free man in New York in 1807, and throughout his younger life worked as a farmer and laborer on his family farm, as his father was a freed slave who owned his own land. He also played the violin in his free time, according to Britannica. By 1841, Northup, his wife, and his children were living in another city, where he was earning a living through odd jobs. It was there that he was approached by two men and offered a job as a violin player in the circus. On the contrary, there was no circus and no job, but just a ploy to scoop him away. When Northup arrived in Washington, D.C., he was drugged and kidnapped. He was eventually sold at a slave market in Louisiana and spent the following 12 years as a slave. A New York Times article from 1853, via Documenting the American South, recounts the condition in which Northup lived for over a decade, including being lashed by his master, sleeping on a wooden board with no mattress, and living in a poorly constructed space that offered little protection from the elements. It wasn't until 1852 that Northup managed to send a letter to friends in New York City who put things in motion and eventually helped release him. Moreover, Richard Bell notes that many details of Northup's story are unusual, in that he was well-educated and middle-aged. Most kidnappers preferred instead to lure away poorly educated children with various ruses. In fact, the abduction of black children from northern cities was so common that parents and communities were on guard against it. Bell writes,
At home each night before bed and again over breakfast the next morning, parents pestered their sons and daughters to stay in large groups, to read body language, to steer clear of certain streets, and to be wary of promises too good to be true.
But that was often not enough to withstand the unscrupulous con men who ran the railroad. Furthermore, the reverse Underground Railroad might not have been as organized in its route planning as the Underground Railroad, but kidnappers had plans and hiding spaces in place to help them move captured people to the southern states. Even if stopped or discovered along the way, many had false bills of sale to explain the black men or children traveling with them. The kidnapping routes often included a brief stop in a basement or out-of-the-way property before they could be ushered into boats heading to the south via the waters of Maryland and Delaware. These water routes could take a week or longer, and once captors and captured slaves arrived in the south, they would be taken to houses of slave owners or other kidnappers before they would move on to their next stop deeper south. Routes usually included a mix of water and road transportation, as well as a long trek to their final destination, which made it easier to conceal the kidnappers' tracks. The travel conditions of the kidnapped were deadly. While being kidnapped was in itself a traumatic experience, for most captured free black people, this was just the beginning of the nightmare. After the capture, their grueling route towards southern states would start. Their journey there included a trip in a vessel resembling a dungeon, being shackled in a windowless room, and a 1,000-mile-long trek to the south that was accomplished mostly by walking. Captured free black people marching to their final destination were often whipped along the way for things like complaining and walking too slowly. Other reports detail instances of frostbite along the route, and many died along the way, unable to complete the trek. Sadly, very little was done to deal with the kidnappings. Kidnappers were rarely caught, and even more, rarely punished. As victim testimony wasn't available, it was easy for kidnappers to change their names or move somewhere else to continue with their business. And with information circulating quite slowly among the population, so many weren't aware of the risks around them, according to a paper published in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. Furthermore, well-organized kidnapping rings were particularly tricky to identify and penalize, as captured free black people could be moved towards southern states quickly before anybody could catch the kidnappers. Although the network of kidnappers in the reverse Underground Railroad was extensive, some kidnappers became infamous for their tactics, brutality, or simply the number of people they kidnapped. Patty Cannon and the Cannon-Johnson gang are good examples of the kidnap pins. Led by a woman and operating in the Delaware and Maryland area, the gang was responsible for kidnapping and selling hundreds of free black people into slavery, according to a historical marker located near the border of Delaware and Maryland. When Cannon's former slave, Cyrus James, was caught, he told the court he had seen Cannon murder several people, including a black woman's child. While most of the gang managed to escape, Cannon was arrested but died in her cell while awaiting trial. In closing, the reverse Underground Railroad serves as a poignant reminder of the complexities of history and the enduring struggle for freedom and justice. While the original Underground Railroad symbolized hope and the relentless pursuit of liberty for enslaved individuals, the reverse Underground Railroad highlights the darker aspects of human nature, betrayal, exploitation, and the systemic forces that sought to undermine that very freedom. Ultimately, the legacy of the reverse Underground Railroad serves as a call to action. It urges us to remain vigilant against the forces of injustice and to advocate for those who are marginalized and oppressed. By acknowledging and learning from this painful history, we can foster a deeper understanding of our shared humanity and work towards a future where freedom is not just a privilege for some, but a fundamental right for all. However, that brings us to the end of yet another interesting video segment. Did you happen to learn a thing or two? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section below. We are always delighted to pick from your thoughts. Also, support our works by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and kindly subscribe to stay tuned in always. Thank you for watching.